Cool. All right. Welcome back, everyone. We just did a quick tech break. So before we move on, though, what I do want to cover, there was a question in the chat, which is actually a great one, regarding how do you actually generate unique keys on the front end. And so to be clear, so the thing that I've shown you over this workshop, let's see, if we take a look at here, OK, line 32. As you can see, this is something that I've cobbled together myself, right? I'm using ES6 template literals to say, I'm going to guess at a unique data type, which is user, and then I'm just going to attach the ID to it, even though I know the ID is kind of not as unique. And so this works, I think, when you're just prototyping and working on things. But obviously, on an enterprise-grade application, that becomes a very different matter, right? Because you're all of a sudden contingent on the fact that someone made the right choice to scope the name correctly. And that's not something we ever want to rely on in terms of reducing human error. So when it comes to actually generating unique IDs, granted, ideally, your backend is doing that for you. But in the event you're not actually getting that information, the NPM module I'd really highly recommend is the UUID module. And so basically, how it works is you'll install UUID on your project. And you basically, as you can see here, you import it at the top of your file. And then as part of creating the new form, so actually, this does happen a lot if you're creating, on the front end side especially, creating new data that you might be sending to the back end. So you might actually have a case where I'm going to just pseudocode this. We're not going to install it, because that would just add to the bloat. But for the sake of demoing this, let me just go ahead and at the top here. So you can imagine that what we would do is we would copy this line, say, OK, we're going to use the UUID library. And then again, assuming we had a new method called add, oh, why is that doing that? OK, add new user. You could then say this.userlist.push. And when you create that new object, this is where you're going to go. The ID is going to be UUID v4 run like this. And then typically, you probably would have some new user object that you have in your reactive data that contains name. Again, let's say Ben. And so what I typically do is I just spread out everything from this.newUser. And then I basically override, in case there's any IDs that are attached to it, this ensures that it's being generated on the fly. And then that's basically how I would approach generating a unique ID on the front end. So hopefully that helps to answer your question. If you need any clarification, definitely ask in the chat. Does anyone here have any questions regarding this approach? Or if you've done anything that's worked better for you, would love to hear about it.
Yes, I got it. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. OK, so let's go ahead and clean this up real quick. And I think, yeah, just check out everything. Perfect. All right, let's reset the context. Boom. OK, did that. All right, we're here. Took us a little while, but we're here at Composition API. And it's time to talk about the brand new thing that is with Vue 3. The first thing I want to caveat when it comes to the Composition API is that even though it was introduced in Vue 3, there actually are ways to use it on Vue 2. So that is one of the things that the team has tried to work really hard on, is that even though there are certain performance optimizations and TypeScript enhancements that have come with Vue 3, as a whole, when it comes to feature parity, the team has actually worked really hard to try to keep it as basically cross-compatible as humanly possible. Because they know a lot of times people, when they're working on enterprise apps, as much as developers would love to be on the cutting edge tool, the reality is that most of the time there's just no time to do that. And so rather than have developers be kind of feeling left out of the fact that they might want to rewrite their components using Composition API, we basically have plugins that allow you to plug in the Composition API into Vue 2. So again, while this is a Vue 3 feature, just know that you can use this in Vue 2. You just need to look into the plugin. All right, so Composition API. Let's talk about it. So remember this lifecycle diagram that we talked about earlier? Up here, you'll notice in blue, there's a very special lifecycle hook that's called setup. And so setup has a very special meaning for us in Vue, because why? Anytime you basically see the setup keyword, the lifecycle hook, you are basically ensured that you're using Composition API. And I think that's one reason why the diagram here actually has it in parentheses. It's because, as we can see here, prior to the setup function, there is nothing else. And so this is what's interesting about the Composition API, is that it happens before the Options API. So what does that really mean? So we take a look at our code. I'm going to hop into the playground so that we can just kind of code some stuff without messing up c'est la view. And let's run, let's see, close that, close, whoops. Okay, open that. Okay, cool. Go into the playground. And then we'll npm run dev. Boom, okay, we have our Pokedex app, and it's running. All right, so let's go ahead and see what is going on here. Oh, for whatever reason, it did not open the actual folder. There we go. Okay. So close this. We're in playground right now. If we take a look at our app.view, you'll notice here that we're running a fetch, and we're doing all this stuff inside of created. Now, I mentioned that the setup function actually happens before init. So actually, if you think about asynchronous functions, they really should be run in the setup function, because that's its earliest point of starting sort of like the component lifecycle. So how that might look is that we actually would have a setup function that's up here at the top. And the reason I think it's important to organize your code this way and putting setup at the top is because everything else below it does not exist. And it's useful to kind of think of it this way, is that, yes, this is what I'm doing inside of here. Now, the thing that makes the composition API particularly unique when it comes to Vue is that everything inside of here is truly vanilla JavaScript. So in other words, we can't just go like, oh, data, function, return, like Pokedex, like all this stuff is gone. Because why? Composition API is about, let's say, I guess we'll call it freedom and flexibility. One of the advantages of Options API is that it provides a very consistent way for you to add stuff. Here's where my data goes, here's where my methods go, here's where my computer properties go. But over time, as people have scaled their applications and components, there are times where people found that they wanted to actually group things according to their concerns and maybe find ways to organize their codes in different ways. And Composition API lets you do that. But what that means, though, is that it's a free-for-all in that you have to organize everything yourself. So in the instance of setup, let's say we want to create let's have a reactive name variable in this case for the region of Pokemon that this is tracking. So the first thing is to remember, this is vanilla JavaScript. So we actually have to declare the variables manually now. So const, let's see, region name equals Kanto. Great. Now here's the thing, though. When we actually look at this, let's look inside the DevTools and look at our app. We'll see here that nothing exists right now. Only the Pokedex is showing up. And the reason for that is because once you're inside of setup, Vue is not doing any magic for you. You have to actually start being very explicit about what's happening. So sorry about that. OK, let me rewind that statement. So the thing about the Composition API is that inside of here, Vue is not doing any magic for you. So unlike when we're inside of data and methods where you can just call this context and it knows to like this.Pokedex, it knows to go inside of data to go get the Pokedex. Like inside of here, everything is like, OK, you wanted freedom? Here's freedom. And so what does that mean? That means that at the end of setup, we actually have to manually return anything we want to expose. And at first, that might sound a little bit redundant, right? You're like, wait, why would I want to do that? Well, because when you're writing JavaScript, because you'll see here now, actually, this is kind of small. So OK. What you see now inside of the DevTools is that, check it out, the region name is appearing. And the reason for that is because when you're writing the JavaScript up here, you probably don't want everything being exposed to your component. There are times certain things might be, call it private, and there are things where like you're running calculations that aren't relevant to the template, to the rest of the component. And so that you can keep all up here. And what you're doing here is then you're returning it. And so when you return it, now it's actually something that you can actually access. So let's say inside of this created method, now it can be like log this.region name. And so we'll see now inside of here, there you go. The created lifecycle hook now has access to the data that we set up inside of setup. Didn't mean to do that, but that's how it worked out. OK. So the question here is, all right, well, I want the ability to run an async function at this point, right? And so your first instinct might be like, well, OK, this makes sense. What we're going to do here is we're going to create a const of Pokedex. And we'll just copy over this await function. And then we'll just make sure that setup is async because this is an await. And then we'll return the Pokedex here. And let's keep that actually alphabetical. And then you might, OK, and then since we're returning it anyways, you don't need to define the data twice. So there we go. And then we actually don't even need this method anymore, right? Because we just refactored it. And then, well, we're running this inside of here. So actually, now that I think about it, we could just say, we just need to delete this. And then ideally, we could then just say this.pokedex. So we should see the region name and the Pokedex show up. But you're going to see Vue yelling at you in a pretty big way. And I wanted to show this error because most of the time, this is not going to be something you run into. But especially when you're getting started and you see this error, it's probably going to be a bit confusing because you're going to look at this. And if we read it, it says that the setup function returned a promise, but no suspense boundary has been defined. And that's a lot of words, right? You're like, what the heck is going on? Well, so just to let you know, what is suspense? So we look inside of the docs. Suspense is another built-in component that is experimental currently with Vue. And the idea behind this is that it's trying to help us better offload performance when it comes to asynchronous options. So in the sense of like, when you're loading something asynchronously, you can have a fallback. So the way that code works, as you can see here, is that, you can see here. So you would drop in your suspense component, and you say, OK, this is my dashboard that I'm loading a bunch of async stuff happening. But in case that fails, or frankly, it's not ready for me yet, I'm going to go ahead and fall back to this template. And so this syntax should look familiar to you because we did this yesterday with, or actually, I didn't say yesterday. Let me go back. This syntax should look familiar to you because earlier we talked about slots. And so here is that vSlot fallback, and this is just this is already defined on the suspense component. And so what you'll end up seeing on the page is you'll see loading first, and whenever it's ready, Vue will automatically switch it over to the dashboard. And so this is actually really useful, but the key thing here, though, to understand, though, especially at this point in the recording, is that it is experimental. So this is why at this moment we're not going to go into depth regarding how to use it and that kind of thing. Keep an eye on the docs if you want to play around with it. But know that this will probably be a pretty key part of a lot of framework approaches going forward, as a lot of frameworks are trying to figure out better ways of server-side rendering different things and how to improve performance when it comes to loading JavaScript on a page and so forth. Now, when it comes to our error, though, the reason this is a problem at this particular point in time is because if we think about it from the tree itself, the app.vue is the root component of everything. So you can't really suspend your root component in a state of nothingness. That doesn't work. And so what you actually have to do, that in the case that you really do need to do asynchronous operations in Composition API, this is where you need to put it into a component. Because the app.vue basically needs to be in a stable state. That's like, OK, I know where everything is. And then this component over here is going to do some stuff. I'm going to hang on to it and give it a backup. And then I can do other stuff over here. But if we suspend app.vue, the whole thing basically, like, because of how asynchronous operations work, it just runs the risk of corrupting it, right? So this is why we don't run async setup at the root level at app.vue. So to show how this works then is we're going to go ahead and create a component called Pokedex. And this is where we're going to go ahead and then we'll have our script tag. And we'll have our template. If it would autocomplete. Sometimes Emmet is uncooperative with me. OK, great. So let's go ahead and blow this up into 2 columns so that's easier to follow. We'll go ahead and bring over this asynchronous request right here. Actually, we can bring over the whole script block. What am I talking about? Bring over the whole thing, which is great. And then this means that this script block is actually no longer needed on this app. Although actually we do need a script block because why? We need to actually import our Pokedex. So Pokedex from components Pokedex.view. And then we can register it on the components. And then we have Pokedex, like that.
We got a case mix-up in the.
Do we have a case mix-up? Oh, we do. I did that again. Thank you for catching that. This is sometimes the trouble with the context switch. OK, so inside of here, we'll have our template here for the pre-fetch. We don't even need this anymore, this button. So all this is going to do is render that as a pre-block. I mean, we can take this here and then we get the Pokedex like this. Okay, so let's take a look and see if this worked out the way we wanted it to. Okay, so first thing first, we'll see that when we're taking a look at this right now, it's still yelling at us, but we actually are seeing something rendered, unlike before. And it's because in this particular case, it's true. We still need to actually suspense component at this point. And so like I said, we're just going to cover a high-level usage of it. We're not going to dive deep into suspense as a component. Because again, if we think about it from the view perspective, is that view is saying, I don't know what to do with this yet. So please give me some sort of fallback so that in case this thing completely crashes, we don't have this hanging component that's not going to do anything. So we bring in our suspense component, and we say, OK, this is what I want you to render. But in case things don't work, here's the fallback, where we'll say loading Pokedex data, just like that. Suspense, suspense, suspense. Yep. Oh, yes, I already know that. OK. So let's restart the server real quick just to make sure that's not anything weird getting botched.
You don't have to import suspense?
No, import. It's kind of like the global component. It's just a global component that's registered. Now, what's weird? Oh, I forgot. Yep. OK. So inside of here, you're thinking, I did the suspense right? I did it inside of my component because I gave it a fallback. But this approach is actually slightly misleading. Or this approach doesn't work because if we think about it another way, it's happening at the child level. And if we look at the error messages again, it actually says that the suspense boundary needs to be found at the parent tree. Because if we think about it another way, remember how we used to do the VIF? This is the same kind of concept, where you want the VIF actually happening at the top for something like suspense because it knows what to handle. So if I go ahead and delete this stuff again, this time we can actually say, we'll have a suspense component here that will then render out the Pokedex component when it's ready, otherwise fall back to this text. That's actually what's happening here. And once we do that, there we go. Now everything is working as expected. And so again, the API for suspense is experimental, but this mental model now of having the ability to suspend your component and then have it switch out with some sort of fallback is something that is growing to be more popular with frameworks, not just Vue. And so something that I wanted you all to keep in mind when it came to that. OK, so in addition, when it comes to, let's talk a little bit more about composition API, shall we? So let's go ahead and just commit this code so you all have that snapshot. So git checkout branch exercise. And then add suspense with Pokedex component. OK. So here's the thing. We have a region name. We have the Pokedex. This all looks pretty good. Except if we take a look at this, actually, and let's say we wanted to change the region name. This is actually pretty common. So let's say we want to say, let's do an H2, and this is the region name. There we go. We see Kanto here. And actually, let me, there you go. Now it's not being clicked. Okay. So if you want to change this, you might be thinking, well, OK, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to say, inside of, we'll create a method here, just to make things very clear, that says change region name. And then this dot region name is going to be equal to Hoenn after this. All right. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a button. Actually, no, that's going to be at the bottom of a very long list. Equals changed region name. And then change region name, save. OK? So far, again, just to recap, we want to be able to change the region name. So we created a button that runs this function that should, as we've been practicing already, just change Kanto to Hoenn. So we say that and click. You'll notice that nothing is happening. And this might feel weird because, after all, isn't this what we've been doing this entire time? The secret to this lies in the fact that what we talked about when we covered setup, which is that everything in here is vanilla JavaScript. So what you're returning here, while Vue will go ahead and register it to the rest of the component, there's no reactivity attached to it right now. Because why? It's a plain JavaScript const. It's a constant. And the same thing is happening with Pokedex. In other words, all the stuff that we were talking about regarding reactive data, computer properties, that will not work with this. Because at this point, it's not reactive. So how do we bring some reactivity? Well, the way we do that is actually by using view helper methods. And so we mentioned that earlier, where a really popular thing now with Vue 3 is the ability to parse out different functions to kind of help people use it in different contexts. Well, there is a helper method for turning something into a reactive reference. And the way we do that is we import from Vue, and we destructure out this method called ref. As again, if you think of ref, think of reactive reference. And so how does that work? Well, what we do is we actually just wrap the value that we want to be reactive inside of this helper method. That's what we do. And so now if I refresh this and we change it, you'll notice it's now actually being tracked by Vue. And so this ref and a lot of the concepts we'll be talking about is actually really critical, because going forward, whenever you're working inside of Composition API, you have to be very explicit about when you want Vue to introduce magic. And so this is actually one of the things I do think that's beneficial to the Composition API, is because now you know exactly where Vue is coming in to do things. Whereas in the Options API, you could argue that this context could be confusing for JavaScript developers, and what if they wanted to come in and change some stuff, right? Composition API is your ability to get at the primitives and say, OK, this is the stuff I want to do, and then Vue, do your magic for this kind of stuff. And so for example, right, if we wanted to say, let's actually have ability to have like an all caps region name. Well, the way we could easily do that is we can have a computed property. That's how I would approach this. So we'll say region all caps. And actually, I'll just be more specific, region name all caps. And what do we need how? We need a computed property. And guess what? The helper method is computed. So we have a computed property. But what we need to do inside of our computed property is we need to run a function. Because if we look back at our other apps that use computed, so let's go back into another component that uses it. You'll see that all of our computed properties actually are functions, which makes sense because they need to run a computation on the things that are the dependencies. So we have an arrow function in here. And what are we going to do? We're going to go ahead and we're going to return, just like we did before, we're going to turn the region name to uppercase. This is probably our first instinct as far as how we would make this work. And so to make sure this works, we got to make sure we return this to region name all caps, just like that. And then let's go ahead and expose that here as an H3. Region name all caps, just like that. And we'll save. And you might notice that, well, something's broken. What's going on? Well, it's saying region name by 2 uppercase is not a function. You might be thinking, oh, this is weird. But region name is a string, right? It's not. Yeah, it's not a string anymore. It is now a reactive reference, which actually some of you have noticed when you're doing the inspecting the element. Let's go ahead and actually log region name at this point and see what we get. If I refresh that, that's fine. We get a massive error. And you'll see things like the ref implementation. You also might have seen as well when you're doing the Options API, you saw proxies show up when you would log out a value. And I know that was confusing at first to some people because they're expecting to just see what the value actually is. But one of the big rewrites of Vue 3 when it came to the reactivity engine is that it's using the JavaScript proxies underneath in order to manage how all the dependencies are being tracked. And so again, you don't need to understand how proxies work for you to be familiar with, or basically to work with Vue. But in case that's something you're interested in, I just wanted to give you sort of like a little bit of a preview of that so that you can always dive into that if you want to learn more about that. But you'll notice here that once again, region name is not a string. What is it? It's a ref implementation because it's a reactive reference, meaning the way we actually get to the value of it is actually to basically think of it as an object now. It's an object that has abilities to update it, its dependencies. And so when we actually want to access the raw value of a reference, we have to actually unpack the thing. And the way we do that is by saying dot value. And you'll notice once you do that, everything works. Now, this might feel a little bit odd after using the Options API for a little while because, after all, in the past, or actually not even in the past, if we wanted to, we could have theoretically created a computed property at this level. And just for the sake of having comparison, this would be region name lowercase. And so what we would do here is return this dot region name dot to lowercase, just like that. And then we'll just add another H3, region name all lowercase.
You said two lowercase.
Two lowercase? Is that what I wrote?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, no, it looks like it's
Just lowercase.
Just lowercase, yeah. Okay, save. Okay. So, oh, that happens to work. Let me have a differentiator here. There we go. Okay, sentence case, all case. Okay. So you might be thinking, well, this is way nicer, right? Like, why do I want dot value? And I'll say when I first was exposed to this, I would agree. It definitely feels odd, but there is something to understand about the reason why this is actually helpful is because we do have to remember that when you're working in vanilla JavaScript, it is important to be able to tell when something is view, when something is not. And so if we think about const region name, the fact that you actually have to unpack the value does signify to people that when they're working with this particular value, that it's already attached to the view reactivity. That said, I wanted to give you the pros of how people see that, because a lot of people do like ref. But in the event you're like, I really don't like ref. What you can do instead is you can do this helper method called reactive. And so what reactive is basically think of the data option from the options API packaged in a nice little helper function. Because earlier, there was a question regarding around the fact that, what if I don't like the name data? What if I want to call it state? Well, we can. In this case, state, it's a reactive object. And inside of here, let's just say, I'll just do like region 2. And I actually don't know a third region. It's fine. OK, I'll just do element type, and I'll just say lightning. OK. So when you're doing the state, first of all, I'll go ahead and log out state. What you end up getting is something that looks like a lot more of what people are probably expecting when they're actually expecting an element, which is just the raw object. Oh, wait, nope, this is the wrong thing. I'm looking at the wrong thing. Here we go. That's what I meant. The proxy. This is what we've seen earlier when we actually inspected the options API element, in that you have to look at the target in order to get underneath it. But what's nice about this now is that, again, this is going to be misplaced. But if we do state.elementType.to uppercase and run it, you'll see it actually just works. And so the way to think of reactive is it's like a nicely packaged way of collecting your refs together and that you don't have to unpackage it with dot value. And so there are plenty of code bases I've seen that people never touch ref. They like state. Or sorry, they like reactive. Because reactive feels like composition, it feels like options API, but you're in the composition API setting. And so is there a right or wrong way to do this? Absolutely not. So for the sake of having this example also be here, I'm just going to say element type all caps. And then we'll make sure to return this here, make it alphabetical. And then I'll just make sure it's here. And then we should be good. OK. So there we have it. This is the fundamentals around composition API. As far as the highlights to consider for this, once again, is that you're now in free-form JavaScript land. So this is where I would say comparing the options API to composition comparing options API to composition API is that options API, you don't need as much JavaScript to get up and running, I would argue. And I've seen that before with people who have just enough to understand the syntax where because of the this syntax, they were able to just kind of get in there, make some changes, make some swaps, and the templating was easy enough that people without a lot of JavaScript experience could actually be productive on a code base. With something like this, however, when it comes to the composition API, as you can see, there's a lot more going on. You need to understand helper functions. You need to know about modules. You need to go ahead and make sure you know if you're using ref that it's a dot value. The skill cap jumps considerably when it comes to the amount of JavaScript you need to know in order to be productive with composition API. That said, let's go and commit this code. And feature add composition API example in Pokedex. All right, git checkout branch 10 solution. Here is your mission. What I want you to try to do is you're going to go ahead and take that user's page that you were working on again. And this time, see what you can do on that component to actually use the setup function to refactor at the bare minimum the fetch data. And don't worry, sorry. So refactor users page to use the setup for fetch data. And then if you have the time, feel free to go ahead and practice using the ref, reactive, computed, or whatever you prefer. And with that, I'll give you all 10 minutes to do that. So I'll see you all on the other side.
Well, probably
Break for lunch right after?
Yeah, well, we could
Do you want to wait to do
break after
that?
the exercise or break now and just eat
Okay.
our sushi while it's fresh. And
All right, why don't we break now, and then we'll have
just
people.
come back at like 12.
Okay,
or-
and then people will do the exercise, and
or
then we'll do the
12:15.
solution. Okay,
Maybe 12:15
12:15. Okay, yeah. So okay,
or 12.
So for those on, you want to do 12:15 or 12?
I don't know. What do you think? How far? Where are you? Are you ahead of schedule or behind schedule or on schedule?
I'm doing just fine managing wise. So
Okay.
do people want 30 minutes for lunch or 45 minutes for lunch?
People seem to use 45, even if we put 30. We usually
Okay.
end up adding.
Then let's just
well,
do that.
I mean, it's 35 minutes. Let's just
Let's go
let's
12?
try to start back up at 12, and if
Okay.
we need extra time.
So for those online, we're actually not going to do the exercise right now. I mean, if you want to get a head start, feel free to. But we'll officially be doing that when we get back at 12 p.m. Central. So we'll see you all then.